We have a very special guest alert because on today's show, we are bringing on the Athletics' Daniel Popper to talk about if Justin Herbert's getting too much hate, if the Chargers could make a big splashy trade, and everything Chargers offseason.
You are Locked On Chargers, your daily podcast on the Los Angeles Chargers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up, and welcome into the Locked On Chargers podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Wade, joined as always by my co-host, David Drogemeyer, and we've been covering the Chargers together now for 9 seasons, but this is our 7th year as the host of the Locked On Chargers podcast, bringing you your team every day. Thank you to the everydayers out there for making us your first listen, and if you want to make sure you never miss big-time guest interviews like the one today, go follow or subscribe for free on the Locked On Chargers YouTube channel, and listen wherever you get your podcasts from, and I'm super excited to have Daniel Popper from The Athletic. The best beat reporter out there, the best Chargers written content that you're going to find is from Daniel Popper. And it's so excited to hear kind of how he felt about the Justin Herbert performance, the DK Metcalf rumors that came out on Tuesday, and just how he thinks the Chargers are going to attack this offseason based on their philosophies. But today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Here he is, Daniel Popper. All right, guys, well, we have our very first special guest of the offseason, and we couldn't have asked for anyone better because today we have Daniel Popper, who's the senior writer for The Athletic covering the Chargers, and he's also the host of Hops with Pop, where he just gets belligerent. No, I mean, he gets to drink on the job, which is something we're always jealous of. But you can find that on his Substack, on his Twitter, at Daniel R. Popper, but you can also find it on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcast from, I'm sure. But Daniel, such a crazy season, Chargers exceeding expectations, but also that comes with the colossal failure at the end of it. But thank you so much for coming on, man. It was a crazy season for sure.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Definitely a disappointing end to the season for the Chargers, I would say. But now that we've had a couple weeks here to digest, I think it's fair to say that the season overall was a success based on where they were and where they are now. I mean, 11 wins postseason. Feel like there's a good foundation set by Jim Harbaugh and Joe Ortiz, something to build on. And I think that the organization is in a much, much better place now than they were at this time last year.
Well, and it's so funny because you kind of have to let the dust settle because it doesn't feel like that. And the problem with exceeding your expectations is you get people's hopes up, and it makes the end feel so much worse, especially for Justin Herbert, because that's the hardest part, right? The fans have to sit with not only that loss, but also that Justin Herbert performance until not only even just next season, you can't really even rectify it or, redeem it until the postseason, which I think makes it so tough for Chargers fans to have it end specifically that way with a 4-interception performance. Obviously, there was so much that went into that game that doesn't have to do with Justin Herbert. And to me, it was much more just about the Chargers being outmatched as we saw them against a lot of the good teams they played in 2024. But how confident are you that Justin Herbert can kind of rewrite the narrative and will have a chance to win playoff games for the Chargers in the future?
Yeah, I'm confident. I've watched every game he's ever played, and I know what level he can play at. And that is an extremely high level, and I think it's a level that's more than good enough to win playoff games and to win a Super Bowl, frankly, with the right pieces around him. I understand where the fan base is coming from. You go into a game like that, and you want your guy to show up. You want to have like the Joe Burrow experience where he's leading the Bengals to the Super Bowl, with no offensive line and he's really raising the team up to a different level. You want those Patrick Mahomes moments where he gets it done in crunch time. And so you can point to your guy and say, listen, look at what we have, right? Like that's what Chargers fans want. And I understand that, but it's still early. Like he's 5 seasons into his career. And like there are comps for this. Like, it's not like he's the first super talented quarterback to come along that didn't get it done early on in his career. And I wrote about it that night, like literally that night from Houston, I wrote about it. Peyton Manning, 0-3 through his first 5 seasons. In his 5th season, lost to the Jets 41-0. He went 14-31 and threw 2 interceptions. Justin went 14-32 in that game. So like the parallels are there. The very next season, Peyton Manning won the MVP and won his first playoff game. He made it to the AFC Championship game. And so like there is a comp there. I mean, you watch in the moment, like it felt like the worst game he ever played. I think it's in that conversation after watching the tape back, but there's obviously context surrounding it. like the offensive line got manhandled, like straight up. It was across the board, all of their worst performances of the season. Jamari Sallier just like wasn't up for it. I don't like really know how else to put it.
Yeah.
The interior didn't protect well. I thought Joe Alt had his worst game of the season. Rashawn Slater had his worst game of the season, and they were manhandled. And as a result, I think Justin Herbert was affected by the pressure early on in the game. I think his decision making was impacted as a result. And then at the same time, he didn't play well and he didn't live up to the moment. But that doesn't mean he's never going to. And I think that's kind of how I framed it all along here is that you can say that he didn't play well enough, but that doesn't mean he's never going to play well enough to win a playoff game. And I think that's what they believe internally as well. I think in private moments, they would probably admit to you that Justin Herbert didn't play his best game, but I think they all believe that he's capable of doing it. The problem is you only get so many opportunities to do it. That's the nature of the NFL. And I think I said this on my podcast that night too. If you're an NBA player and you're in the Eastern Conference semifinals and you go 1 for 13 from 3 in game 2, you're going to have a game tomorrow.
Right.
You're going to have another shot to go out. If you do that in the NFL, you got to wait an entire year. And in Justin Herbert's case, he hasn't gotten it done yet. And so the weight just gets heavier and heavier.
Yeah, it sure does. And the critics, they get louder and they get louder. But we know that the Chargers need to give Justin Herbert more weapons. And an anonymous NFL coordinator said that Jeremy Fowler, through Jeremy Fowler, that the Chargers could trade for star wide receiver DK Metcalf. Do you think that this new regime with their philosophies would be willing to make a splash and, obviously pay a receiver like that top of the market money?
I mean, the fit makes a ton of sense. He fits what they need, right? Because Ladd McConkey is going to operate most often out of the slot. He's a star, and he's really good in that role. But what he needs is a player on the outside that can really challenge defenses down the field, especially in 50-50 ball situations, which they just didn't have this year. If you have a legit outside guy and Justin Herbert makes that poor decision to throw across the field, there's a chance that guy plays DB in the situation and knocks the ball away, and that game's completely different. And that's just one example. But they really had one guy in Ladd McConkey who could beat man coverage all season. And so when you go into a game like that, teams are going to blitz you, they're going to play man behind it, and they're going to double Ladd, and they're going to ask your other receivers to win. And that's ultimately what happened in this game. So the fit makes a ton of sense from that perspective. DK Metcalf is your prototypical outside receiver. He can make plays down the field. He would fit well with what they need from a skill set standpoint. The other factor is Sanjay Lal, the receivers coach, was the receivers coach in Seattle. And so there's that line to draw as well. A big part of DK Metcalf's development was playing under Sanjay. I think you've seen similar developmental approaches to DK Metcalf and Quentin Johnston. So there's a fit in that sense. Now the question is the money. I just pulled up his over the cap just to take a look at this because I saw that report, but I didn't actually dig into it. You're talking about, taking on about 18 million next year, a little over 18 million. That's pretty reasonable. It would be an expiring contract, which fits into their mold of trading for players on expiring contracts that they can then factor into the comp pick formula because they complete the contract with the Chargers. So I think on a number of levels, it makes sense. The question is what would the demand be, and would they be willing to part with the necessary draft capital? But from a bunch of different standpoints, I think the fit makes sense.
Yeah, I know I didn't mean to put you on the spot with that specific question about him, but I think the bigger part is just the Chargers and how many big wide receivers they're linked to, right? You see them, oh, hey, Tyreek Hill is unhappy, or you link them to the biggest wide receiver free agent out there with T. Higgins if he becomes available. But I do think there is a thought process out there that with a Greg Roman, Jim Harbaugh type of team, that wide receiver is never going to be what they think is at the top of their list or a position that they're willing to spend top dollar on. And I think that is part of kind of where when you get into these conversations of would they get rid of the draft capital and all that is one part of it, but would they actually be willing to pay a wide receiver with the way they're trying to construct this team top of the market money? And do you think that they would?
Yeah, I mean, well, these situations are different, right? When you trade for DK Metcalf, you're paying 1 year at 18 million. If you're signing T. Higgins in free agency, you're paying $30+ million a year, and you're talking about, okay, now he might have a lower cap hit in 25, but then what does it look like in 26 and 27? That's when you're getting up to $25 million cap hit, $30 million cap hit, $35 million cap hit, et cetera. So that stuff matters. And so you're trying to align it. In reality, they have a rookie right tackle. That's one, obviously very important position. He's going to be cheap. Rashawn Slater, I think both sides have an incentive to get a deal done this offseason. So his cap hit's probably going to drop from 19 million to something more palatable. So for 1 year, paying a receiver $18 million and then getting the opportunity to potentially get a comp pick out of it later. Like that's one scenario.
Yeah.
Now if you sign T. Higgins this offseason, now he's more aligned with the cap hit structure of Rashawn Slater's contract if he signs an extension this offseason. And now you're talking about a huge left tackle cap hit, a huge wide receiver cap hit, and a huge quarterback cap hit all aligning at the same time. So like that's the kind of calculus that you're doing when you're thinking about this. So it's not just will they bring in a big time receiver, it's what's the timeline, what does the contract look like. On a broad level, they should be looking at every single avenue, full stop, period. Like they should be looking at top of market, they should be looking at middle of the market, they should be looking at the trade market, they should be looking at all of the receivers in the draft. Like this should be an all hands on deck type situation. I think they will. That's how they've approached roster building. And so I don't get this. Like, I think from a positional value standpoint, like I think they're always going to value like offensive line play over receivers. I think like on a general level.
Yeah.
But like, I don't think that like that approach and sort of, approaching positional value that way precludes them from like ever bringing in, one of these type of receivers. It just has to make sense financially with the cap and how everything's structured in terms of the roster.
We have more great stuff to get into with Daniel Popper after this, including his thoughts on the Chargers bringing back offensive coordinator Greg Roman and more in today's Locked On Chargers podcast. First, though, I need to tell you guys about FanDuel because from the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. And right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. That's $300 in bonus bets to keep the action going. The FanDuel app is easy to navigate, and there's so many great bets to get into, and especially for a weekend like this, they have specials going on all the time, including who is going to have the most passing yards this weekend. Patrick Mahomes at plus 135, Josh Allen at plus 230, and so many other great things, including anytime touchdown scores, which is always going to be my favorite. And you can also get just any player going for 150 or more rushing yards at plus 170, and it feels like Saquon does that every single week. But all you have to do to get in on the action for anytime touchdown scores or any of the playoff specials that they have going on for championship weekend, you just have to go to FanDuel and visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $300 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. But Jim Harbaugh and Joe Ortiz did also announce this offseason that they wouldn't be making any coaching changes, which led fans to be upset about them keeping Greg Roman, but they will at least have continuity, and that's kind of what they said at the press conference. Do you think the criticisms of the play calling and the offense disappearing too often are fair, or do you think it's kind of like Justin Herbert where it's hard to evaluate him with the personnel problems that the Chargers had?
Well, like, I think some of the criticism is fair. But the question is what type of criticism are you talking about? Like the people that are out there saying that he's the only reason the offense struggled in certain situations and like he needs to be fired and like under no circumstances can he return. Like I don't buy into that. Were there play calls that made me scratch my head? Yeah, like going to Quentin Johnston on 4th and 2, one-on-one against Derek Stingley in man coverage on a route that Quentin doesn't run well. Like that was peculiar to me. Like calling that. Yeah. Play action shot play from the wrong hash like that. I didn't fully understand so, and there were moments like that all season, but there were also really good moments. And like, I'll tell you this, I know the run game never really got there, but what like the creativity and variety in the run game was something that I had not seen from a Chargers team since I started covering them in 2019. Like they really did a lot. They tried a lot. They worked really hard to try and find out what their guys could do well. I thought for the most part, they were putting guys in good positions. Like I think one thing they leaned into a lot was Zion Johnson as a puller. Like you see his athleticism, you see his movement skills, you're trying to lean into that. Now, like at the same time, there's also criticisms of the run game, right? Like I think that they ran to the right side too much. I think it was very evident like about midway through the season that like they should run behind Rashawn Slater and Zion. And that should be like, what they major in the run game. And I feel like they tried to do a little bit too much in terms of spreading it out, So like to me, like Justin Herbert needs continuity. Like the time to sort of have this conversation was probably when you were building the staff and not now. And so like the fact that they turned things around and they won 11 games, like keep it together and let this guy for one time in his career, really learn an offense top to bottom. And like the only other time he kind of had that was 21 into 22 after year one of Staley Lombardi. And then he got hurt in the second week of the season, was playing through fractured rib cartilage. So we never even got to see what it would look like when Justin Herbert really got to have continuity and build, within an offense. So I fully understand them keeping the staff together. I think there are certain areas that you could absolutely criticize Greg Roman. But for now, it seems like the right decision to keep everything together, to keep the staff together, and see what it looks like when you get to build year over year and not have this offseason where every time Justin Herbert shows up in early April, he's learning an entirely new playbook.
Well, how can you ever get to version 2.0 of that offense if you're relearning an offense every single season? Like, it's hard to really build on the initial offense when you're continuously having to change it up. But one of the position groups that let the Chargers down consistently this season and in the playoffs was the interior of the offensive line. Bradley Bozeman is the only starter headed into free agency, and they said that they want him back. But it would seem crazy to run it back with that specific group. How likely do you think it is that fans will get what they want and see multiple new starters on the interior in 2025?
I think that's what should happen. I think Bradley Bozeman really loves playing for Harbaugh. He loves playing for Greg Roman. I think one thing that fans don't really get to fully understand is what an impact he had off of the field as a leader in the offensive line room, translating this scheme and this philosophy to the offensive linemen. All of those guys love Bradley. And there's value in that. Now, as a stopgap option at his price, under $1 million, I think it made sense. You knew what he was coming into the season. I wrote about it in May. I did a film breakdown. I'm like, this is what this dude is. When he goes forward in the run game, he's solid. Doesn't really move that well. He's a liability in pass protection. But you're going to get availability, and lo and behold, he played more snaps than anybody in the offense. And you know what you're going to get. There's going to be consistency in how he plays. Now, some of that consistency is limitations, right? But you know what you're getting. And they got exactly what they thought they were getting. And it worked. For a season, they were able to piecemeal it together and get 11 wins out of it. Now you have an opportunity where you can potentially upgrade. Now, I think there's value in bringing Bradley Bozeman back as a backup, where he can, maybe you take a center on the first 2 days of the draft as the long-term answer. You bring Bradley Bozeman back. They, compete for center, but in reality, he's more of that veteran guy that helps in the transition. And he can also play guard. They worked him at guard a little bit. So he gives you that veteran center guard flex guy that can go in there and give you a functional level of ball when you have an injury. That makes sense to me. And he wants to be here. He's probably going to test the market and see if he has a chance to start somewhere. I don't see that happening. And so in reality, you bring him back on a cheap deal and, he's still that same presence off the field that you got, and he gives you a little bit of depth, and you look into the draft to find your long-term answer at center. Now guard's a little bit more interesting. A lot of fans were calling for Jamari Salyer to play, and he played. You guys got what you wanted, and it didn't look good. I don't think he's a potential starter at that spot. Yeah. I think he can be a depth piece maybe, but I just don't think he has what it takes to play at a high level at that position. Just what I've seen and what I saw in the Texans game. Now, Trey Pipkins was battling through a lot of injuries this year. I think his natural position is at tackle. They moved him into guard. They tried him there. I give him a lot of credit for not complaining at all and moving inside and trying a position he's never played before and still giving them at times decent play, right?
Yeah.
But you have to look at it and you say, okay, his cap hits $9.5 million next year. If you cut him, you save a little, you save 6.75. Is that a way to get more cap space that you can then spend on a potential starting replacement? That's something they have to consider. But I kind of wrote about this last week. Jim Harbaugh and Joe Ortiz wouldn't take my bait in the press conference where I was just trying to say, you get to this moment you get to this moment in the playoffs and your weaknesses can get exposed. Do you put more stock in a performance in a playoff game when you get to play the best of the best in the biggest moments, or are you looking at the body of work? And they said, body of work. I think that when you get to a moment like that and your entire philosophy revolves around being the physical enforcers in the line of scrimmage and in the trenches, and you lose that battle handily, and the very obvious weaknesses are on the interior, that's going to be a priority because you want to play a certain way and you weren't able to play that way against the good front in the playoffs. So I think you look for an upgrade at center, and I think ultimately you look for an upgrade at guard. Now, to me, it's going to be center in the draft. That makes way more sense. I know everyone's looking at Drew Dahlman. I don't know if he's going to hit free agency. Like a good young lineman very rarely hit free agency. When they do, you're typically overpaying for them. There are like legitimate guard options. Now, like obviously Trey Smith is a guy like top of the market where you're looking at, some of these insane guard contracts that have been handed out if he hits free agency.
Yeah.
But a guy like Aaron Banks out of San Francisco, like maybe you can get him at a more mid-market price and upgrade at right guard. So like I think that you could absolutely see 2 new starters on the offensive line this offseason. And I think a big reason for that is, yes, there were weaknesses all year, but what happened in that game, I cannot imagine Joe Ortiz and Jim Harbaugh watched that tape and said, yeah, we're going to run this back. Like I think they're going to watch that tape and say, this is not us. We can't play like this. We have a philosophy and we have to get our roster to a point where we can play within that philosophy.
We have more great stuff to get into with Daniel Popper, including some changes and potentially improving the offensive line and why it was so important that Jesse Minter is back for this Chargers defense, and more in today's Locked On Chargers podcast. Therapy is a game changer. It can help manage stress, improve sleep, and communicate more effectively, but finding the right therapist, fitting sessions into a busy schedule can be a challenge, and that's where Talkspace comes in. Talkspace, the leading virtual therapy provider, makes getting the help you need easy, accessible, and affordable. With Talkspace, signing up is simple. You can match with a licensed therapist who fits your needs, usually within 48 hours, and it's convenient. You can have sessions from the comfort of your home and even message your therapist between appointments. Plus, Talkspace is covered by many insurance plans, and for most insured members, there's a $0 copay. It's never been easier to prioritize your mental health, and that's something that I've had to deal with, especially doing a show like this and being in anything sports related. Having someone to unload some of my problems onto, and just saying some of the crazy thoughts that happen in my head and having to say them and having someone listen to them has been so helpful for me. But as a listener of this podcast, you'll get $80 off your first month with Talkspace when you go to Talkspace.com/LockedOnNFL and enter the promo code SPACE80 to match with a licensed therapist today. Go to Talkspace.com/LockedOnNFL and enter the promo code SPACE80 to get $80 off your first month. Show your support for the show. That's Talkspace.com/LockedOnNFL, promo code SPACE80. Yeah, absolutely. And you just wrote a great piece in The Athletic about just how what they told us at the very beginning could give us a great idea of how they plan to attack this offseason. Specifically, are built around having a good offensive line, and Andy Bischoff saying, hey, we're an offensive line team. This is an offensive line building, and all the kind of mementos and stuff they put out there at the beginning. And I think the hard thing, too, is it's hard to judge one guy when all 3 guys are struggling, right? And so if you get 2 out of those 3 guys, can that elevate into Zion Johnson if they plan on having him come back? And I think we saw with Corey Linsley how much having a great center can elevate the guards around him too. And I think that, also in the running game and how much that can help you there, hard to get an idea of how good your running backs are if guys are getting blown up into the backfield. So there's just so much that I think starts in that spine of the offensive line. But one more here. One of the things that got criticized.
Good points all around. The Corey Linsley point is a really good one. Yeah, like you're right. A better center elevates everybody.
Yeah, and so hopefully that's a place where they invest, and you've seen like a Ryan Kelly and other veterans that have gotten linked to the Chargers too. But let's talk about the defense, and one of the other coaching things that came with Greg Roman staying is Jesse Minter didn't get a ton of buzz. And I think that's such great news for the Chargers is that, at one point it seemed like it might be one and done for Jesse Minter, and that kind of fizzled out. But how important quickly you're, just I know we're running out of time, but how big was that for him to not really get the buzz in this head coaching cycle? And anything can still happen. There's still openings there, but for him to be coming back and getting a second year with the Chargers.
Yeah, I'm not overly surprised. I had heard rumblings by like mid-December that it probably wasn't going to happen for Jesse Minter this year. Then the Bucs game happens, and it's like I think like if they had gone out in that game, and like played well, it might have changed things. But I think having a performance like that late in the season probably delayed this thing for another year. I will say I think he's a phenomenal coach. And I don't just mean that from a scheme perspective. I think that his approach is perfectly tailored to being a head football coach in the NFL, just because of how willing he is to delegate, how much he trusts his assistants. Like that stuff is really, really important. The way he communicates, his demeanor. Like one thing I was watching was after the Bucs game, what was his demeanor? He was the exact same dude. And he just told the truth and was fully honest. Like, yeah, we weren't good enough. But it's not like it didn't seem like he felt any pressure. It didn't seem like he changed at all in terms of how he messaged. It was the same exact guy. And like, that was actually a big tell to me that like, okay, he's got what it takes, but I mean, it's enormous. Like, I think like from somebody like me who watches like every play and like is
Right.
deep inside the X's and O's to like your average Chargers fan who reads nothing, watches no tape, and just throws the game on every Sunday. Like anybody can see what kind of difference he made in terms of how the defense played. And you can get into the nitty gritty and be like his 3rd and 8+ calls where he drops 8 into coverage, but he's showing cover 0. Like that stuff's amazing. Or you can just flip the game on and be like, look at how fast those guys are playing. Look at the way they're tackling. Look at the way they're hitting. Look at how much fun they're having. Like, look at how many times these guys are like tight in coverage and like how few busted coverages there are. Like, right. Like this little stuff like that. So, he was a huge part of this turnaround because they were able to play defense at least close to the level that Jim Harbaugh wanted to play. And they did it with some pieces, right? But like focusing on Derwin James, right? He got the best football out of Derwin James. He got the best football out of Elijah Molden. He got 2 5th-round rookies, right? Got the best football out of Deion Henley. Got the best football out of Puna Ford. You sort of go down the list of like all of the guys that really were able to excel. Like Christian Fulton was a functional player for them. Like all of this kind of stuff. So, I'm excited to see what the defense looks like in year 2 when all these guys can again have that type of continuity and really learn and grow within a scheme. I think they all feel really confident within the scheme. There's a trust between the coaching staff and the players. So, monumental. It's hard to overstate how important Jesse Minter returning is, and I think that there's a very bright future ahead for the defense.
And if Brandon Staley's failures brought us anything, it's that teams are hesitant to bring on a hot first-year defensive coordinator, even if he has the best defense in the league. But Popper, likes to rain on that parade and says, actually, the Eagles, because of pick sixes and whatnot. Chargers #1 defense.
Wait,
no, I'm
hold
just
on.
kidding.
Hold on. I was not raining on any parade.
I'm just kidding.
I know. I want this on the record, though.
Okay.
I just care about the facts. So, when people are tweeting out, #1 scoring defense, well, the reality is they weren't. They were the #2 scoring defense, but everyone's saying they're the #1 scoring defense. So maybe I'm being a stickler, but there's certain parts of NFL
That's why you're the best.
that drive me insane. So one thing that drives me crazy is that 3rd down defense and 3rd down offense does not include penalties that lead to conversions. So there was a time in 2023 when Brandon Staley was saying that they had a really good 3rd down defense.
I remember that back and forth.
They led the league in 3rd down penalties. And so when you factor in 3rd down penalties, they went from like a top 10 3rd down defense to like 25th. So
which is what we all saw.
Right. So the Eagles actually allowed fewer points because when you're talking about #1 scoring defense, they're factoring in special teams touchdowns and touchdowns scored by the opposing defense, which I don't think is fair to put that on the defense.
It's not.
So
yeah, no, no, I know.
It's fine.
I saw that.
I just like the facts. I like the truth. That's what I'm always after. All right.
Daniel Popper, I don't, I don't know if people realize and fully appreciate what you do, but I just know that, hey, you're the best out there. You're #1, one of one. I appreciate, when you were asking Brandon Staley the tough questions, you were a hero, and now you've lived long enough to see yourself become a villain because you're asking questions to the great Jim Harbaugh. But hey, puts out the best written Chargers content out there. The spoken Chargers content, Hops with Pop, something that is totally unique to the Chargers universe that has a ton of voices. There's not much out there like Hops with Pop, which you can find on his Substack or you can find on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast from. So, hey, thank you so much for taking the time today. So much good stuff to get into this offseason. We don't have a new head coaching search, which was fun to fill last offseason with, but there's plenty for this team to do. So thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Man, Daniel Popper is the GOAT. He always crushes it every time he comes on. We can never have him on enough. I hope Chargers fans appreciate what a good job he does around this team because most team doesn't have the coverage that the Chargers have, and specifically what Daniel Popper brings to the table. So thank you again, Pop, for coming on the show. We really appreciate it. And for all the listeners out there, we'll continue to keep bringing you as many special guests as we can throughout the offseason because there's a lot to talk about this offseason as the Chargers try to turn from being a playoff team to being contenders in 2025. But make sure you guys are back here tomorrow because we're going to talk about, hey, we talked a little bit about weapons today with Popper, DK Metcalf, guys like that. But what about the first round tight ends everyone's buzzing about? We're going to get into those guys, Colston Loveland and also Tyler Warren on tomorrow's episode as we bring up what the rest of the Chargers' biggest needs are and kind of tier those out offensively and defensively. So to make sure you don't miss it, go subscribe or follow for free on the Locked On Chargers YouTube channel and listen wherever you get your podcast from, as well as finding the show every day on all of our social media. You can find us on Twitter at Locked On LAC, on Instagram at Locked On Chargers, and our Locked On Chargers Facebook page. We will be having a fan mail show on Friday as we do every week. If you guys want to get in on that show, you can also call into 323 524-7924 to get your 30-second Chargers voicemail in there. But such a great show. So glad that we could have Popper on, and make sure you guys are back here tomorrow as we start breaking into who the Chargers could go with this 22nd draft pick, and it's looking like tight end is a very real option. So until then, guys, take it easy and go Bolts.